Talking about the infrastructure, I want to introduce Steve Canale. Steve is a VP in SoftLayer. He is responsible for the product selection and management of our sales teams. He came to SoftLayer from The Planet. And in The Planet, he was responsible and he was managed the enterprise and total control sales divisions. He's got a bachelor's from East Texas State University. And he's good at financial services. He's worked with a lot of folks like Wachovia and Fidelity, and he's good. And I'll talk to him after this because I need some help in that regard as well. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Well, it was a very lengthy introduction for me in terms of my past, but appreciate it very much. Thank you. I first want to start with a little bit of history on SoftLayer, so familiarize you guys with it a little bit. SoftLayer was created in 2005, and we created the company with this crazy idea of pre-racking and stacking all of the equipment inside of the data center that customers could leverage to deploy their applications on. And we wanted to enable customers to do this in a very short amount of time, in minutes or hours versus weeks or months that we were typically seeing customers take to deploy infrastructure. And we also wanted to layer an API on top of that infrastructure so that customers could programmatically interface with that infrastructure. And we didn't really know what to call it when we first got started. Was it hosting? Was it grid computing? Was it infrastructure as a service? And it really wasn't until about a year later when Amazon came along with AWS and they started calling it cloud. So all of a sudden, that's when we started selling cloud. And it was last year, fast forward to last year, when IBM purchased SoftLayer. And it's been an exciting ride for me personally since that time. SoftLayer is something I'm very passionate about. I've been very fortunate to travel around the world talking about SoftLayer. I could probably talk about SoftLayer for hours. Unfortunately, I only have about 20 minutes to do that. So we'll see how well I do on timing. Next, if you take a look at this slide, you can see some of the cloud evolution that we've been experiencing. And the first shift that we see a lot of customers trying to do or think about is this idea of forklifting applications from their existing data centers into the cloud. The challenge or the problem with that is many of these applications are legacy applications that aren't necessarily cloud-enabled. So where we see more success is customers adopting a hybrid cloud type approach. And a hybrid cloud type approach allows you to keep some of your legacy infrastructure inside of your own facilities, but then connect those facilities to a SoftLayer data center so that you can slowly migrate those workloads over, or maybe even burst into the cloud from the SoftLayer infrastructure. But we also see a lot of success with customers trying to develop new workloads into the cloud. And that's very successful because you can then make those applications from scratch that are cloud-enabled. And we also suggest that customers think about things in terms of disruptive technology. Jeremy talked a lot about that this morning, and we encourage the enterprise to really start thinking about how they can be disruptive inside of their own industry. Because if you're not, then someone like these guys will come along and start being disruptive to your industry. Just a couple of quick examples. Nest created a little thermostat, sits on your wall, seems pretty normal. But in reality, what's happening in the back end is Nest is uploading all of that data to the cloud. They're then monetizing that data, selling it to utility companies, and disrupting how we normally think about creating power and how much power utilization a utility company is going to experience, and then making modifications based on that data. Netflix, Jeremy already talked about that. Everybody knows the story. They pretty much put Blockbuster out of business by creating a streaming video service. But now they're not just sticking with that and not evolving. They've started creating their own content. They have their own production studios. They have their own shows, so on and so forth. So They put Blockbuster out of business, but they didn't just stop there. They continued to innovate. WhatsApp is a text messaging service. If you don't know about it, your kids probably do. It's very popular with the younger generation. And they disrupted the telco industry, which was a billion-dollar business for text messaging, and just created this little widget, this little application that you can have on your Android or iPhone. And you can text message unlimited, as much as you want, for about $2 a month. And when WhatsApp came out, telcos were charging much more than $2 a month to send those messages. So they were disrupting that telco industry specifically for the text messaging side of the service. I already talked a little bit about the history of SoftLayer. What the fundamental idea was, there were 10 founders, of which obviously I am one of. And we founded the company with 4 key principles that we wanted to maintain. First is innovation. We wanted to be the innovative leaders in our field. Like I said before, we were really first to market with cloud, even though we didn't know to call it cloud. We were the first to market with that type of product or service. But we also wanted to provide a digital feel to a physical data center for all of our customers. So we wanted to empower them in a way that they felt like it was their own infrastructure, even though it was inside of a SoftLayer data center or up in the cloud, so to speak. Automation was critical to us as well. Automation is what allows us to be able to deploy in minutes or hours versus weeks or months. So when we created SoftLayer and we created that set of APIs, we wanted to make sure that everything was automated. Pretty much everything inside of SoftLayer happens from an automation standpoint. And then integration. Integration is important. Again, I mentioned that concept of hybrid clouds. We have to give customers the ability to integrate their existing data centers to a SoftLayer facility. So we wanted to make sure that we included some tools to enable that or to make that happen. Next, talk a little bit about the compute product itself. When we created SoftLayer, the initial product was a bare metal server. So this is a single tenant environment. It's highly customizable. You're going to be able to pick the exact processor, the exact amount of RAM, what kind of storage you want, whether it's local or SAN storage. But the key differentiator here is because it's a bare metal server, it doesn't have a hypervisor on it. So you're not losing some of the performance of that machine to the hypervisor tax. So when you're deploying things like databases or big data or analytics, these bare metal servers can really excel much better than a hypervisor-typed environment where you see with most of our competition. We also created a virtual server instance as well. This is where we're using a hypervisor. And SoftLayer has the keys to that hypervisor, so we're deploying those compute instances for you. But where we differentiated ourselves is by offering customers the ability to have both a single tenant virtual machine as well as a multi-tenant virtual machine. And what I mean by that is if you have a single tenant virtual machine, we're putting just one customer's virtual machines on that physical device. If another customer comes in and buys a virtual machine, he's going to go somewhere else. And we also, of course, have a multi-tenant compute offering as well, too. So for customers who are more cost conscious but not necessarily as worried about security, then they can choose that multi-tenant instance as well, too. And then the last one is private clouds. In SoftLayer's world, a private cloud is where we take a bare metal server, we install the hypervisor on top of that bare metal server for you, and then we turn the keys to the hypervisor over to you. So it doesn't matter whether it's VMware, Hyper-V, et cetera. You pick whatever hypervisor you want. We'll put it on top of the server for you. We'll handle the licensing, but you're then in control of where you want to deploy those, which machines, what kind of redundancy, and so on and so forth. On top of the compute, we also created our global network footprint. And we wanted to do a unique deployment where we interconnected all of these data centers together. And the benefit of interconnecting all of these data centers together is customers can now deploy compute in multiple different facilities around the world and then use that private network that SoftLayer maintains and operates to be able to pass that traffic across in a much more secure fashion. You're not having to transfer that data over the public network. So again, when you're concerned about the security aspect of things, having access to that private network capability is going to be very important as well. When we came to the merger with IBM, SoftLayer had 13 data centers, primarily here in the US, but we had started some international expansion as well too. We had a facility in Amsterdam and also a facility in Singapore. Now, since the acquisition by IBM, IBM has committed $1.3 billion for new investment of additional facilities. A lot of those are international, but we're also continuing to expand here in the US as well too. We've already launched a number of those new data centers, Hong Kong, London, Toronto, Australia, just to name a few, but that expansion is going to continue over time. And the idea is we want to enable customers to push their content as far out to their end user as possible. If you're hosting your content as close to that end user, they're going to have a far better experience because they're going to have lower latency. And when we've got data centers all around the world, it allows us to be able to enable customers with that. I mentioned this set of APIs that we laid on top of the infrastructure that gives customers the ability to programmatically interface with that. We called that set of APIs IMS. IMS is essentially the operating system for SoftLayer. IMS controls the data center, it controls the deployment of the servers, it controls the network itself, whether it's the network internally for a data center or that global network that I referred to earlier. It even controls things like sales, finance, your billing, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very important, critical piece for SoftLayer, but IMS, again, is built on a set of APIs. So if you want to do anything inside of IMS, you can do it via those APIs, or you can leverage the web GUI face that we created, which is just an implementation of those APIs. We also see a lot of customers create their own portal. If you want to create a portal that you're going to hand over to your employees, but you want to limit access to certain things or customize it or tailor it to what's going to make the most sense for you, you just use that set of APIs, write your own, and turn that over to your employees. So it's very flexible from that standpoint. So just, again, to hit on a couple of the key advantages for SoftLayer and why you would want to leverage SoftLayer. This concept of complete control and complete transparency of the environment. We're going to give you information about every single piece of your infrastructure, whether it's the network itself, globally or inside of the data center, whether it's the compute that you're on, what type of processor you're on. We'll even give you the firmware version on the rate controller that's inside of that system. You're going to have access to as much, if not more, information about your infrastructure than you might even have inside of your own data center. Now, does everybody need all of that? No, they probably don't. But your systems guys, the guys who are used to working inside of the data center and having that information, are going to appreciate the ability to have it. Some developer may not need to know the firmware version on a rate controller, but if you did, it's there and it's available. That concept I mentioned earlier about single tenant as well as multi-tenant, I talked about that in the compute side of things, but that concept stretches across the entire SoftLayer product portfolio, whether it's load balancers, firewalls, security appliances, everything. We're going to give you the option to choose either single tenant or multi-tenant. If you think about a lot of the competition out there, that's not necessarily something you're going to have the ability to or the transparency to be able to see into. And I mentioned multi-site topography, the ability to deploy in multiple different locations. That can be beneficial for disaster recovery as well as pushing that content to the end user. These facilities are all N+1 in terms of redundancy. That includes the cooling, that includes the power, and it includes the network as well too. So we've put together a complete set of products and services to, again, enable you in a way that you can feel like SoftLayer is your own virtual data center. So from a customer momentum standpoint, when SoftLayer first started, obviously not a lot of brand name recognition, but our customer base was primarily these born-on-the-web companies. Why did they come to SoftLayer? They didn't really have the capital to go out and buy their own infrastructure, or their VC didn't want them spending millions of dollars buying infrastructure because they weren't sure if they were going to survive or not. And by leveraging SoftLayer, these born-on-the-web companies were able to turn, instead of their infrastructure into a CapEx model, it's more of an OpEx model. And these customers were running their entire businesses on SoftLayer, their entire businesses based on the internet. So these were for these startups, mission-critical applications that were running on top of SoftLayer. As SoftLayer began to evolve, we did start to see some penetration into the enterprise market. Enterprises were hearing this term of cloud. They were interested in trying to explore it a little bit. And we ended up getting some large brand enterprise-type customers, customers like Repsol, customers like Citrix, et cetera. Now, of course, we're part of IBM today, which gives us an enormous amount of brand credibility and name recognition. So, like all of you guys here today who are almost exclusively in the enterprise side of the business, you guys are starting to recognize the power of the SoftLayer cloud and the ability to start offloading some of your legacy applications into the cloud or develop new workloads on the cloud. We're also starting to see a focus on or a shift to some of the, what I'll call next generation type applications, things like Mongo, things like Cloudera, Cloudant, et cetera. So the enterprise has shifted from this notion of uncomfortable with the cloud not necessarily being secure, to really starting to leverage the cloud, and then also even leveraging some of these open source technologies that have recently been developed too. So how does SoftLayer fit into the IBM strategy going forward? We saw this slide a little bit earlier today, but SoftLayer is that infrastructure as a component piece. And you can come to IBM and buy just the infrastructure itself, but IBM isn't stopping there. IBM is taking all of their SaaS properties that can be cloud-enabled, all of their PaaS properties that can be cloud-enabled, and putting them on top of SoftLayer. So what does that tell you about IBM's confidence in the SoftLayer infrastructure? It's pretty strong, considering their willingness to move all of these systems over to the SoftLayer infrastructure. A great example of that is Bluemix. I can mention that since the live demo went successful. But Bluemix is built on top of SoftLayer as well too. Things like Watson or Watson as a service, those are going to be available on SoftLayer also.